Perfect. Perfect. Okay, then let's get started. Well, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Elissa Red-Miles. So Elissa is a PhD student at University of Maryland. She's going to wrap up her PhD fairly soon. She's been a visitor to our institute several times before, so many of you are probably already familiar with her. So I'm going to keep this introduction informal and brief. So Elissa works broadly at the intersection of security, privacy, decision-making processes, and applying social science and methods from economics literature, as well as to how people make decisions about their security and privacy, and inequities that arise in the decision-making process. She has done an amazing amount of work, published loads and loads of top-tier conference papers, won awards, all types of awards, including Distinguished Paper Award at Usenix Security, as well as there is this award that is given for students, the John Crott Award, which is for exemplary research in usable security and privacy. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks, Krishna. So today I want to talk about decision-making. And most of us have to make decisions every day in our lives. And when we make those decisions, we can either take our own expert point of view, or we can look around to others and try to learn from what they're doing to make our own decision. And this is true in computation as well. So today, computational problems are requiring a lot of decision-making. So in security, we're constantly trying to decide what are the appropriate requirements to set, how should we prompt users, what should we make them do, what should we stop making them do. And then in machine learning, we're trying to decide what features are fair to use or most accurate. And typically, it's experts who make these decisions. So in security, you're going to have security professionals or researchers or even the government that sets out policies for what the best practice is. And in machine learning, you may have algorithm designers or researchers here making decisions about what's fair to use and how best to go about deciding. And when experts decide, they tend to make trade-offs. And this chart is from some recent work at Princeton, where these researchers published a case study of how they made the decision of whether to publicly release a research data set. So they were trying to decide whether the benefit to science outweighed the risk to people of being de-anonymized by their release of this data set. And they sort of found through their own observation of their decision process that they were making this sort of normative trade-off decision. And we can imagine that this is the same for classifier accuracy trade-offs versus unfairness of including certain features. And hopefully in security, we're balancing the benefit to security against the burden that, say, requiring someone to do two-factor authentication is going to impose. One of the problems with expert decisions is that the experts do not always agree. So we know from the popular press that sometimes NIST and other security experts have to correct their advice, as well as from research in which in 2015, some Google researchers took a look at what experts would recommend for security practices and found that over 50% of them disagreed on what to recommend, and some of them recommended practices others explicitly said not to do. So there's a lot of disagreements among experts. Additionally, and probably more importantly, the experts and the users for whom they're making these decisions may not agree. So as an expert, how much burden I think two-factor authentication poses versus how much burden it actually poses to, say, my grandmother or somebody else can be very different. And experts do not always have the insight to necessarily know what their users would prefer or what they would experience. And this tension between what experts would prescribe and what users would either naturally do or prefer is actually classically posed in moral philosophy. So when trying to make moral decisions, there's this tension between experts and the users or people for whom the decisions are being made. And so the question is whether we can use more descriptive approaches in computational decision-making. So instead of always having normative decisions, can we find some balance between listening to people's natural behavior and preferences and prescribing what we as experts think that they ought to do? And I want to explore the idea of using descriptive methods in 3 different studies, in 3 different sort of areas of this space. So in the first, I want to explore how we set security policies and whether we can learn from people's natural security behavior to set them more effectively. In the second, I want to look at selecting which features are fair to use in machine learning classifiers and see if we can, again, learn from people's preferences to make these decisions. And finally, in the third, I want to see if instead of learning from preferences, we can directly make a decision together with the stakeholders or with the users in order to define some ethical guidelines about what content should be allowed in virtual reality and the appropriate security and privacy requirements. So I want to start out with security. Typically, in security, we try to get people to behave safely by prompting them. This is especially true of end-user serving platforms like Facebook or Google. And what I mean by prompting is something like this, which you've probably seen before. So this is Google's two-step verification prompt. So they're trying to get you to install an app that's going to send the code to your phone and secure your account. And until you decide to install this, they're going to keep prompting you at regular intervals. And typically the way these decisions for prompts are made right now is very normative. So security researchers or security experts inside the company decide two-factor authentication is the way to go, and then they decide that every user needs two-factor authentication as fast as possible, and they're going to keep nudging them until they do it. And the most amount of user preference that happens tend to be sort of A/B testing on these messages, maybe, not always. So the question is, instead of just sort of endlessly poking them, can we look at how people respond to these prompts? Can we model their behavior? And then can we optimize how we're prompting based on their natural behavior? Can we make this more customized or personalized? And if we do that, will it be more effective? So first, we need to model how people respond to prompts. This was an open question. And typically, there's two methods for modeling security behavior. You can work with a company or instrument people's machines, and you can take a look at log data of how they behaved on various applications, and then you can build some statistical models of their behavior. This is nice, and when it's very realistic, you're looking at their real behavior, but you have no control over the situation. This isn't a controlled experiment, and you have a lot of other confounders that you can't take care of. So in order to provide control, people often ask users to imagine how they would behave in a survey. The problem with that, as I showed in some recent CCS work, is that people have sort of systematic biases when they respond to these surveys. So they think that they're going to behave a little bit better than they really do in reality. And when they're taking a survey, because it's not super realistic, they're not very sensitive to changes in message design or other controls. And so to try to solve that issue, I designed a new method drawing from behavioral economics, so a new system for observing security behavior. And in this online system, users are invited to create an account, and the account is going to behave like a simple bank account. So it's going to hold their study compensation, and just like the real world, it has a risk of being hacked. But in this case, unlike the real world, it's an explicit risk. So they're told ahead of time there's going to be this random number generator, and whatever percentage chance risk of being hacked you're told in the study is your chance that your money will be taken away. And if your money is taken away, you don't get paid in the study. The users are then invited to make a security choice. So just like in the real world, if they decide to enable two-factor authentication, it's going to lower their risk of being hacked. And again, it's going to be an explicit protective value. But again, similar to the real world, two-factor authentication is going to increase the cost of completing the study. And I, as the researcher, can control exactly how long it takes for that text to get to you, whether or not it was actually the right code or you have to do it again, to vary this cost component. And finally, I need to use people for whom the 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minute to do two-factor authentication actually matters. And for that reason, I chose to use Amazon Mechanical Turk workers who earn money for very small time increments doing tasks. And I picked the incentives in the study to match either their hourly wage or twice their hourly wage, so there was sufficient incentive, but not sort of out of proportion. Okay, so to go in a little bit more detail, this is what a participant would do. They would create an account using their mTurk ID, and they would create a password. Then they would be explained more about the study. So, like I said, at the end of the study, they're compensated with the money left in the bank account. In this particular case, they started the study with $5, and they were told that they had to log in once a day. Now, the reason they have to log in once a day is if they choose to do two-factor authentication, I want them to have sufficient costs from having done so. And I did variations of this experiment where it was once a week and so on and so forth. And then this participant was told that studies indicate that 20% of users will have their accounts hacked over the course of the year. And so I mathematically used this in my random number generator to decide whether they got hacked. And the study has some variations. So instead of starting with $5, you could begin the study with $1 and earn more every time you log in. So we're able to test some sort of traditional economic effects of like endowment and valuation of account. Additionally, I vary this hack percentage such that I will be able, at the end, to have sort of a general model of how people respond to these risks. Then I offer them the chance to enable two-factor authentication, where I tell them how much two-factor will protect them. In this case, 90% of the time, but again, I can vary that value. Finally, if they decide to enable two-factor authentication, they're going to get a text with a code, and as I said, I can control how long it takes to get to them. And finally, I make them log into the system regularly so they have the cost from two-factor authentication. So I'm not going to go into the details of the experiment design or the results. If you're interested in whether the behavior was rational, I point you to the paper. But what's relevant for this talk is that we wanted to be able to model how people respond to prompts. And so the first question is, if we're going to try to follow natural behavior when we're designing security requirements, it can't be just random noise of behavior. And so the question was, can we actually model how people respond in security? And this was an open question because a lot of security research has used this common quote, which says that users will pick dancing pigs over security every time. So basically, they will do anything but security, and there's absolutely no reasoning behind it. But what we found here was that was actually not the case. So we can model user behavior fairly well as a function of the variables we measured in the system and variables we controlled. So variables we measured could be things like how long it took you to do the task, or what your typical past behavior was if I had you do the experiment multiple times or gave you a survey, as well as things I controlled like the risk and the amount of time cost to get the text. Okay, and this explanation of variance of 61%, typically in psychology experiments or where you're modeling human behavior, you'll see values around 30% explanation of variance, so we're actually able to model it fairly well for humans. Okay, so the two key things that we saw were that differences in ability, so differences in how hard it was for you to log into the system or how hard it was for you to do two-factor authentication, those altered your behavior. And not necessarily in perfectly rational ways. So if it was really hard for you to do this, even if it made sense for you to, you were going to be very resistant. And this means that not everyone is getting the same value out of the same security behavior, right? Because there's variable cost, and you're still getting the same utility back for this variable cost. The second was that differences in account valuation altered behavior, right? So if I started someone with $10 in their account, they behave differently than someone with $5. And those two people who started with a larger endowed value behave differently than someone earning the money, which is sort of a typical economic effect that people want to protect what they already have. And so what that means is that we might want to shift from our current sort of normative view, right? So right now we prompt everyone to do two-factor. And people are so inundated. There's lots of research with fMRI studies that ignore these prompts. And also, it's kind of unfair because not everyone's getting the same thing back for their behavior, either because their account is worth something different to them or because it's harder or easier for them to do. And so the question is, can we adjust prompts, customize messages? And by that, I really mean, for example, customize the timing of the message, not necessarily the language. So let's say I just opened a Gmail account. then my valuation of that account based on the messages I have and so forth may be very different than someone who's had the account for 10 years. So perhaps I, as the company, should sustain the risk to your account for 6 months before I try to prompt you to do two-factor. Also, I can consider if you're someone for whom this is really, really difficult, and therefore you are having such high costs, I could allocate some resources to you. I could give you a YubiKey, which is a little technology you can stick in your computer that you tap, which maybe will be much easier for you to use than this sort of SMS or app-based kind of thing. So that's very nice that we would like to make things descriptive, and we've inferred that maybe people would prefer that, but how are we actually going to make those decisions? What we're going to use is we're going to use mechanism design. So this is a typical game theoretic approach in which you try to model all of the entities or decision makers in a system, and you know that one of them has control. So in this case, it's usually the firm, right, Facebook, that has some control over what messages and what resources are given. And then you try to optimize how the firm should pick those things for each individual person. And so in order to do that, we want to find out, like, what are the levers that the company has control over. In this model, we think about the company having control over 3 things. The first is the behavior. So they decide what security behaviors to offer people. They decide how costly they are, how high quality. So for example, the cost of a two-factor authentication subscription can range from like $6 per user up to like $50,000 per year. And those offer both different protective benefits as well as different speed of operation. So they have some choice about how much they invest there. They also have choice in the timing and the design of these messages and whether they lie to people or not, right? So in my experiment, I could have told you that your risk of hacking was 50%, even though it was really 20%, and that probably would have nudged you to behave in a different way. And finally, they have resources, like these YubiKeys or a helpline or something like this. What? That they can allocate? I don't think that was me.
Wait.
This isn't my screen. Sorry.
We got Peter's screen now. We have Peter's screen?
Yes.
Sorry.
No
I managed
problem.
to share my screen.
Okay, I was like, I could try to tell you about that, but I'm not sure I know much about it. Okay. Yes, so then we have some resources. So these are things the company can control. And in order to decide how to allocate things, the company is also, if they're doing this descriptively, instead of just having the CSO or other security people like pick these values, they maybe want to learn a user behavior model like we did. They could use ours or they could learn their own from their data, right? And so they're going to, for each user, they're going to develop this model. And this model is going to make some predictions about how the user is going to behave. And here I've shown things that we found relevant in our model, so the user's skill or ability, their account value, their past behavior. All of these things, as well as the information from the firm, are going to feed in and produce some behavior and also produce some costs and utilities for the user. And so the company is going to have this model, and they're going to feed in all their users, and they're going to rotate through some different values that for investments and behaviors, different messages, different resources. And they're going to have some behaviors that they predict would happen. And whether people enable or don't enable some security behavior is going to affect the company's cost model, right? So they often, in the case of banks in the US, they actually have to pay people back if they get hacked. In the case of like Facebook or Gmail, they may lose engagement if people get hacked. They tell their friends they don't want to come on the site, so on and so forth. They also may have cyber insurers who have to pay out and then will charge them more money. Okay, and then their investments in these resources are also going to be costs. So they predict some cost, and that cost is going to feed into their profit model, and they also get profit from these users, right? They're not just little risk bunnies. They also are interacting on the system, and they're getting advertised to, or they're having their money invested by the bank and so forth. And they're going to produce some estimate of profit, and then this is going to go in a circle. So they're going to iterate through different values they could pick here until they settle on some that maximize their profit, assuming that's their goal. And so we could write this out more formally, in which the company is going to want to maximize profit over these variables while not exceeding their budget and while knowing that you can only make security behaviors so good. So you're never going to find a perfect security behavior. And then they have a profit model based on their gains and their costs. Okay. And so in order to solve this, we'll do some linear programming. And what we're hoping to get out is some set of, some set of ideal messages that are customized per user, and some set of ideal resources for some of the more needy users. And so this might allow us to do a more descriptively based security prompting or policy setting method. Now, one of the things that can happen here is the company is obviously acting in their own interest, and this is true today as well. So they don't really care how much security people have to do on every single website and whether that's exceeding the user's compliance budget. They're just sort of like, they only care about themselves. And so we could imagine in the future there might be a policymaker that imposes some constraints. So we would have to solve this problem in a way that minimized the variance in costs between users so it was more fair, or minimize the variance in risk, or they might require that the companies somehow know about how much security people are having to do on other websites and like not exceed a total budget. You can imagine expanding this out. Okay, so in this case, we observed some behavior. We inferred that they might prefer something more descriptive based on how they naturally behaved, and then we showed how we might be able to do theory to make a decision. Okay, this doesn't mean there aren't problems with the descriptive approach, right? So the first problem is that people might not know their true feelings about things like account value. So in the case of my experiment, this is fairly simple, right? $10 is greater than $5. Okay, nice. In the case of like Facebook or Google, you may not know how you'd feel if that account gets hacked till after it's hacked, and that's a big problem for the company. So that may be somewhere where we still need sort of normative evaluation of what accounts are valuable. The second is that in security, we actually don't have measures of behavior efficacy or risk. So when we come up with a new behavior, we usually have some proof about how secure it is, and then we roll it out to people. And we don't know whether it improves the security by like 1% or 10%. And so this problem is something that I'll be working on in future work through some collaborations with 2 different companies in which we're going to actually do some measurements of how effective certain security behaviors are and how much risk is sustained to accounts by looking at the signals of threat that are predicted for these accounts. And in that way, we can actually test this optimization framework and see what happens to these like alert indicators of security over time by using descriptive versus sort of normative approaches. Okay, so the next question is, this took a lot of steps. We had to model behavior, then we had to infer preference, then we had to do this modeling. Can we get there faster? Can we just ask people what they would prefer to have happen? And that's what I'd like to do in this fairness problem. And so in this problem, we're going to try to determine what features are fair to use in a classifier. And in order to do that, we're going to try to model how people naturally reason about fairness, how they would pick the features, basically, and then include and weight the features that we put in the model based on those fairness judgments. And we're going to do this in the context of one specific system. So as most or all of you probably know, the Compass system is used in a county in Florida to help judges make bail decisions. So it takes some inputs about the defendants into a classifier. It predicts a chance that they will commit a crime again. It tells that to the judge, and then the judge uses that information along with their own knowledge to decide whether or not this person should be released on bail. And in more specific, the inputs are people's answers to this questionnaire. So they answer questions about their current charge, the criminal history of their family and friends, their performance in school, so on and so forth. None of these things are legally sensitive or legally disallowed, but when the press came out about the system, a lot of people had opinions about whether the questions that were asked were fair. And so some subset or all of these questions are fed as features into this model, which then goes ahead and produces this chance of recidivism output. And so the question is, that was raised in all of this press, are some of these features unfair to use? Should they have been thrown out? And traditionally, when we used to make bail decisions, it was judges who decided to admit evidence. So they would have evidence that's presented to them by the different lawyers, and they would decide whether it was admissible or perhaps it was obtained in a non-private way or it wasn't relevant. So the judge is the one who got to make this decision about what's either not fair or at least inadmissible. Now, arguably, in the Compass system, we have algorithm designers or questionnaire designers who are serving as the people who select which features to include and not to include. And so our question was, what if we followed people's beliefs about fairness? So in the US, at least, there's this tradition of being judged by a jury of your peers. Maybe this algorithm's set of features should also be determined sort of by populist vote, or at least in part. And the first question is, if we want to follow people's beliefs about fairness, do they have beliefs about the fairness of these features? And also, again, similar to the last problem, are those beliefs consistent enough to follow, or are they just sort of all over the board, which would make it hard to use them in computations? And so in order to assess people's fairness beliefs, in this case, we're going to use a survey. And so we presented people with this scenario in the survey in order to get their judgments about the fairness of these features. So we told them judges in Broward County, Florida, have started using a computer program to help decide which defendants can be released on bail. The computer program they're using takes into account information about the defendant's stability of employment and living situation, and we would vary this as that's our feature. For example, it'll take into account the defendant's answer to the question, do you have trouble paying bills? And then we asked the survey respondent to rate on a scale from 1 to 7 how fair they thought it was to determine if someone could be released on bail using this information. And in order to make sure that people were actually understanding the survey and going to be able to give responses that aligned with what we thought they were answering, we did cognitive interviewing, which is a method of pre-testing surveys where you invite people to open up the survey and think aloud to you as they answer it in order to probe whether they're understanding, say, the word fair in a consistent way, or whether they're understanding the points on this scale from 1 to 7 in a way that's consistent between people, right? And we also collected 2 different samples. So we looked at both Amazon Mechanical Turk and what's called a census representative panel, which is basically drawing from a company that recruits a bunch of people, and you can sample people with the demographics of the US. And what we found was that findings were actually pretty consistent across both of those samples. Okay, so people did have opinions about the fairness of these features. So they thought that certain features, like including information about the person's current charges or their own criminal history, were pretty fair. On the other hand, they did not think that including criminal history of family and friends, or quality of social life, or education and school history were particularly fair to include. So we found out their preferences, but what we saw was that they weren't necessarily consistent. It was not that everyone had these same beliefs about fairness, especially sort of in that middle range. And so the question then becomes, is this because people are the wrong ones to make, or like lay people are the wrong ones to make these decisions? Or is there something else going on that's causing sort of this inconsistency? Yeah?
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
So how do you control for the fact that some people might be confusing unfair or useless?
Yes. So we did, in the cognitive interviews, probe that, and we actually found that they had like an innate sense of what was fair, and that, which I'll get to in a minute, actually useless was part of it, but not kind of their whole idea. Yeah. Sure.
So in any of these samples, like of people who were participating in the survey, are there people who were themselves probably incriminated sometime in the past, but now they are clean?
But now we filtered out those people. So no one who had like committed a crime, and no one who was from Broward County, Florida, where this is used. Yeah. Although that's actually something that Krishna and Nina and I want to do in future work, is actually look at if you're a person who has been through the criminal justice system or you have family members who have, how does that change the results here? Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right. So, okay. So in order to look at this inconsistency problem, we wanted to see if, exactly to the prior question, if we could break down how people think about fairness. And so in order to do that, we looked at prior literature on how experts make these decisions. So experts tend to be lawyers, philosophers, sometimes economists. How do they decide things? And we found that there were these 8 kind of sub-questions or underlying properties that made up the idea of fairness. So whether something was reliable, relevant, private, or obtained in a way that didn't preserve privacy, whether it's volitional, you had control over it, or it was just luck that you were born into, say, some family or some situation. Whether it's causes the particular outcome, so is it kind of useless? Does it cause a vicious cycle? This is something we talk about a lot in sociology. Whether it causes disparity in outcomes, and whether it's caused by being a member of a sensitive group. So even though I'm not including race, am I including something that's so much a proxy for race? And we wanted to know if we knew what people rated these properties, if they rated from 1 to 7, is this thing reliable, relevant, so forth, could we predict what they would think about the fairness? And what we found is that we could. So we had 88% accuracy predicting fairness based on people's answers to these properties. And so what that means is that given 2 people who rated the properties in the same way, they would reach the same rating about fairness. But someone who rated the properties differently is going to reach a different conclusion about fairness. And so the inconsistency that we were observing was actually not in the mapping from the properties to the fairness, but really in people's ratings of the properties themselves. And so what this means is that we may need a combination of, say, descriptive and normative decision making. So the mapping function, people are really good at. The property judgments, they're not very good at, or at least they're very inconsistent. And so perhaps judges or other experts who've been trained to evaluate reliability and relevance and so forth should be the ones providing that rating to feed into this sort of mapping function. And in the future, at least for some of the causal properties, you could imagine even computationally evaluating some of these things so that you don't even have the bias from, say, the judges coming in, and you just use this sort of descriptive mapping function. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, so what is the rationale for why the judges are more reliable about their judgments on these properties versus their judgments about fairness?
So they aren't necessarily. That's something we'd love to do is survey them, but they're hard to get at. I think it's mostly they've been the ones traditionally to do this, and theoretically in the 3 years of law school they're supposed to learn how to do it. That said, currently you have one judge perhaps who does this. I personally think it should be a group of them for kind of the same reason that we see here, individual people, there's a lot of noise. And to the degree we can, I think computation would be like a better way to get there, but I think we have a long way to go, at least with causal modeling for doing
Right, I mean, for example, I would imagine that judges from different political parties might give very different answers.
Sure. Yes, so we actually looked at political leaning in these answers, and that's why I think kind of a panel approach is probably the right answer. And one thing we're looking at in a paper we're working on now is sort of what would a representative panel look like? Like, what are the dimensions that affect people's decisions here? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so in this case, we asked people about their preferences, and then we had them. Now we need to make decisions, right? So we know what people would prefer in terms of fairness, or we have some fairness values for these features, and we can do sort of a constrained search problem a little bit like the security one, in which we say, okay, you can't pick any features below a certain fairness threshold, or the sum of the fairness of the features must be below or above some threshold, and we can look for features that maximize accuracy within those constraints. And I point you to Nina and Bilal and Krishna's paper for theory on how to do that. Okay, so finally, I wanted to explore whether instead of asking the users, we can just work with them in order to make these decisions. So can we skip the step of asking them or observing them and just work with them? And so in this study, we wanted to determine guidelines for developing virtual reality content. And in order to do that, we co-created standards or guidelines with VR developers. And this perhaps seems like a little bit of a strange problem. And the reason that we wanted to look at that was as a result of some of our work in security and privacy. So in an interview study that I did with a group of undergraduates, we asked VR developers about their security and privacy concerns, and we also asked VR users about security and privacy concerns. And what we found was that concerns emerged that weren't just about security and privacy, they were also about well-being, which was a lot of things like ethics and how psychologically intense, say, a schizophrenia treatment VR experience was and how to evaluate those things. And what we kept hearing from the developers was there's a big list of unknowns right now. So VR is only adopted by like 3% of the population. It's expected to grow a lot, but there's no like best etiquette for the user, what's going to keep them safe, what's going to keep them comfortable. And another developer said, like, the fact of the matter is there are no VR power users, and I can count on my hand the number of experienced developers I met. And so what we found as we were doing this study is the developers kept asking us as the researchers, hey, is this an okay thing to do? Or can you tell me what how I should secure my system? Or can you tell me whether this is an ethically okay thing to develop? And so what we thought was, instead of us prescriptively or normatively telling them, especially for the ethics part, what they should do, why don't we propose a high-level set of principles and let them revise and add to those principles? So what we did was we synthesized 6 high-level guidelines based on both what the developers had said in interviews as well as what the users had said, and based on some sort of past research on, say, Android security and privacy and so forth. And then we invited 11 online communities of VR developers to edit our draft principles. And so this is what the document looked like in the midst of being edited by the developers. So the document in the week that it was being edited was viewed about 1,000 times. Of those 1,000 views, 245 people were on a platform where they could actually edit this Google Doc. And then of those 245 potential editors, 19 people edited and 7 people shared, which in Wikipedia editing literature is sort of an implicit acceptance or participation. And this engagement is about equivalent, actually, to what you'll see in terms of passive versus active in Wikipedia editing. And in total, these 19 editors made 40 different contributions. So some of these were revisions to the 6 principles that we had proposed, which had a lot less text, so they added a lot. And they added 4 of their own principles. They commented to each other. They deleted other people's content. They added it back in, so on and so forth. And the paper has ethnographic analysis of this editing process. But the key thing was that they actually reached consensus. So at the end of this week-long period, they had created basically this set of 10 principles for VR development. And as you can see, a lot of these principles are pretty high level, right? Like, they're not a security library they can go and use. They're sort of higher level guidelines about not doing any harm. And the interesting thing that we saw afterward was that we had reach outs from developers who said, oh, I'm working on a security library that's going to be useful for other people to do this principle. Or can you connect me to someone who works in psychology who could help me make like an evaluation questionnaire for how intense I should rate my VR experience, there's currently no ratings, to deal with the do no harm principle. So they were kind of putting these into concrete action. And the other interesting thing was we often get asked, okay, like a lot of these seem like they could apply to other kinds of development, like app development. Why do you need to create a new set of standards? And the answer is that a lot of the people developing in VR are not traditionally developers. They would probably call themselves content creators. They might come from artist communities. They may come from animation communities. Some come from development backgrounds. And so they didn't really feel any ownership over the existing guidelines or like it fully met their needs because now they're dealing with biometric data and fully immersive experiences. And so one of the things about working directly with the users is you really have their buy-in. And I think that was part of why we saw so much active work after this, was they really believed in what they'd created. So in general in the talk, we've explored different methods for doing kind of descriptive work in computation. So in the first, we observed behavior, and then we as researchers kind of inferred what should happen after that. In the second, we asked what would be fair, and then made decisions. And in the third, we actually worked directly with the developers to have them make the decision. And these methods have different prerequisites. So the observation and question asking requires some consistency. I don't want to make my computations based on random answers to questions or random unpredictable behavior. That's not going to make for good computations, and it's probably going to potentially be worse than having a normative decision. So you need to have some high predictive accuracy, so on and so forth here. With the co-design, you have sort of a different constraint. You either need to recruit a lot of people so that you think you'll get like a broad sampling of the decision, or you need to have people that you, at least somewhat normatively, think are going to make good choices. And the reason I raise this is that we often get asked, why didn't we have the VR users participate in this co-design of the ethics guidelines? And the reason is that when we did our interview study, we actually found that the VR users were very homogenous, and they were pretty exclusionary in their opinions. So when we asked them about VR and whether they feel safe and so forth, they said things like this. If you use VR, most likely you're like me, and you also use Reddit because there's a certain kind of crowd that's really into this. And it's somebody who has a lot of money and a premium setup and people with 4+ sensors. And then they said things like, I'll only be concerned about virtual crimes and bullying and safety and security once VR becomes open to the general public. And so when we talked to them, they said, well, our security mechanism that we would want is just a gated community. You have to have this much money, you have to be like me, nobody else comes in, I'm good, I'm safe. And so as researchers, we made a normative decision that since we couldn't find any other opinions currently in the user population, this might not be the approach we wanted to represent in the document going forward. That said, we could have made a normative decision, say, later on and let them edit it and then done some revisions, but that's not what we chose here, but we could. So in general, there's always sort of a balance between descriptive and normative. I don't necessarily think one is always the right way to go, and perhaps there are cases where you never want to ask people, like how effective a medication is or something. And so in security, we need still normative expert judgments on how effective these behaviors are in order to decide what we should allocate. And in the future, I'm hoping we can computationally measure this, but right now it's security experts who get to decide. In the case of machine learning, we saw that people weren't so great at evaluating those properties of relevance and so forth, so we either need experts to judge or eventually computational valuation of those properties. And finally, in virtual reality, we had to be normative as researchers and decide who to include in the study or not. And you could imagine sort of an endless nest of these decisions. Like you could ask users who they think should be the expert that decides on the machine learning properties, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of endless balances here. And so in this talk, hopefully, I've showed some ways in which descriptive solutions can be used in computational problems, and illustrated how different balances can be achieved, and maybe this would apply to some problems that you have in terms of starting to use human inputs to improve computation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alyssa. We have time for questions.
Yeah.
I have a question on this co-design study. So for the design that you kind of like crowd generated, do you have an intuition on how the contributions and the acceptance would change if you would make it more specific? Because you said like you had like very general phrases like do no harm, but what would change, for example, if you would turn the first phrase into do not show roller coaster rides?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually saw that a little bit. Is it in this one? Okay, it's not in this one, but we saw that a little bit around accessibility. Oh, maybe it is here. Yeah, so here you can see someone added this principle. We didn't have it, but you should include options for people with various disabilities. And then someone came along and said, well, as long as it doesn't hurt the design of the project. So that was a much more explicit thing, and they said, whoa, that might change my design. And then somebody else came in and they commented on that. And then finally, what was eventually reached at the end was like, okay, we should have modular design so people could add in their own accessibility tools. So we're not taking on that responsibility, but we should be very transparent about what you need to enjoy the experience so you don't get kind of tricked to come in. And so they did sort of try to negotiate and balance like this person's view and the person who really wanted it to be accessible. That said, I think the further down you go, absolutely you're going to see more disagreement. So for example, we saw a lot more disagreement on the accessibility one than like the do no harm one, for example. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So if I'm a VR developer, I could proactively read this list of things and become aware of them and then go off and develop my VR experience.
Sure.
And so similarly, at the start of the talk, I could be a web developer. I could read about all the security options available to me, and I could go away and build my app and decide I'm going to prompt for two-factor authentication. So sort of combining the two, what do you think about how you would actually kind of promote the adoption of these things more actively rather than just, this is basically complete.
Passively, here's this thing. Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of things going on. So I think in the case of the security requirement setting, the main way to sort of promote active adoption, or what I've seen work when I've talked to companies, is that this will presumably help them reduce costs. And so they're super motivated to do anything that will help them reduce costs. So I think that's one big thing, right, is to provide some incentive where it benefits them, and well, on the side, it also benefits the user. In the case of things like this, where there's not necessarily an incentive, one thing that's been done in security is to kind of check compliance, whether or not developers meant to not comply or did intend not to, is scanning things like GitHub for certain kinds of code that are exhibiting certain vulnerabilities or bad libraries, or I don't know, intensity would be a little harder, but you could do spot checks. That's one method. So actually, as part of the security work, we actually did like a privacy policy audit, because a lot of our developers said, hey, you know, it's a great idea if I'm going to put it all in a privacy policy. And when we checked the privacy policies, less than 5% of them mentioned any VR data. And very few apps even had privacy policies. So there's sort of this like, yeah, great big ideas, and in reality it doesn't happen. So I think some of that is sort of auditing, and you can pick stick versus carrot in terms of how to go back. Yeah. But I'm very open to other ideas. Yeah, Till.
Yeah, you said you had this behavior model for users with respect to security, but also with respect to judging the fairness based on various properties. And I'm just wondering, like, these behavioral models, what is the hypothesis class that they're typically chosen from, right? So I think in the fairness context we had a linear model, but can you usually model these things well, given that you have found the right sort of input features with something like linear models? Like, what's the human reasoning complexity for one?
Sure. Yeah. So for the security one, it's a logistic regression, and that fit fairly well. Sometimes I will rotate through different models. A lot of times it's relatively linear or logarithmic shaped. Occasionally, there was one problem where we were looking at the relationship between skill and behaving securely, and that was actually much more of a polynomial-shaped decision process in which it sort of goes up and goes down in certain ways. So sometimes you do have to explore, but I would say traditionally, logistic is probably the most often used for behaviors. And there may be some like backup testing on that I don't know in psychology, but I can look. Yeah, it's a good question.
Are there questions from Kale? Because you're on a very small portion of the screen, we cannot see if somebody is raising hands. You have to speak up. Pardon?
If they talk, I think it'll.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, in the code design process, were there categories that dropped out completely or changed in content so that they were not at all what they were before?
Yeah, so none dropped out completely, but let me see if I have it in here. So let's see. I think the asking for permission, we had something very different, like respecting privacy or something like this, and they changed that a lot into this more active, like explicit requesting, which I actually thought was a great change on their part. But that one changed entirely. So we didn't put a lot of text in here. We mostly had the headers, and so that was probably the one that changed the most. Yeah. Yeah.
And following to that, if you would have like a set of power users that are more heterogeneous, would you present them this edited sample or the original?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm not sure if there's a best way to do this. I guess my gut reaction was I would have had them all work together, because I think there would be some interesting, one of the things we were looking at was sort of the interactions and doing this tracing of how they interacted with each other and revised. That said, I could imagine also having them each come up with their own and then having an iteration in which they try to merge it. That could also be sort of interesting, and you would have less influence from, say, developers really wanting to ask for permission, and maybe the users would be like, oh, okay, fine. Whereas what they would really want is something else. So I think you could try multiple ways. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.
Elisa will be here for the rest of the day. I think many of you have some meetings already scheduled, and if you want to talk, just drop me a note. I cannot promise that we'll have the time, but I'll try to squeeze you in.